And welcome to Design for Inclusive, Just and Green Missions, which is a special panel event looking at hopeful and possible alternative futures as part of our annual gathering for the Mission Oriented Innovation Network. My name is Rowan Conway and I'll be your moderator for the next hour with a panel of wonderful leading thinkers and doers in design. Before I introduce them in more detail, I just wanted to thank you for tuning in and invite you to submit any questions or queries you have for the panel on any of the points you'd like us to address today. If you do that in the Q&A first, you'll actually be sort of ordered and stacked in terms of me reading them out afterwards, but do please feel free to comment in the chat and then we'll save them for later in the discussion. But with the housekeeping over, let's get on with the session. By way of background, firstly, let me introduce myself. I was formerly the head of the Mission Oriented Innovation Network at IIPP, and I'm now a visiting professor of practice and policy fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where I teach on the MPA with Dan Hill on the module called Transformation by Design. As a practicing strategic designer, the intersection of design thinking and transformative innovation is really where I'm most interested. So I'm delighted to be joined by such a wonderful panel of design thinkers to help us explore ideas about how we might think differently about the role of design in an era where we need green missions to adapt to some of the major challenges coming ahead. So I'm joined by Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel, Director of Undergraduate Programs Design Studies at North Carolina State University, by Bason, who's CEO of the Danish Design Centre, and Dan Hill, who's Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova in Sweden. Together, we will examine the power and potential for design shaping inclusive, just and green missions and share your insights on how to broaden our understanding of design thinking and to create how design thinking might create wider value for generations to come. So what's today's conversation about? As any designer will tell you, the role and disciplines within the field of design have changed beyond recognition in the last 20 years, and increasingly design is being deployed or seen as a vital tool that can play a key role in tackling global challenges. As Christian in his new book or forthcoming book points out, the book I believe is called Expand, and Christian, you can expand on it later. The days when designers were concerned largely with physical objects and graphical communication are over, or toasters and posters, as I think you say in your book. Today, to paraphrase Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon, design concerns any activity that seeks to change a current situation into a preferred one. And so if the last century saw the role of design in society grow from enabler of industrialization and mass production to drivers of digital innovation, where will it go in the future, especially in an era of climate crisis? If design at its best is making things better on purpose, I say in inverted commas, then surely it has a vital role to play in creating green and just transitions. So let's start our exploration of this subject area in Denmark with Christian. Christian is the author of 7 books on design, innovation, leadership and governance, and has a long history of applying design thinking to public problems. As from 2007 to 2014, he was director of MindLab, the Danish government's innovation team. And today, as CEO of the Danish Design Centre, a publicly funded institution based in Copenhagen, he works with leaders and organizations to apply design methods, foresight and systems thinking to their most challenging problems and opportunities. In pursuit of the vision of shaping the next society, DDC have recently launched a missions playbook, so we'll try and dive into that a little bit more. Denmark is widely recognized as a climate progressive country, and in 2019 saw the launch of the Danish climate law, which marks a profound shift in policy in a state model from moving from growth-focused competition state towards a mission-oriented entrepreneurial state, as Mariana Mazzucato might say, that promises to bring Denmark 70% below its 1990 emissions by 2030. In effect, this provides the opportunity for transformational societal mission. So, Christian, I'll go straight to you. As a designer working with governments, can you tell us more about the Danish approach to green missions and what role design can play in delivering on them?
Right, thanks for your kind introduction and for the invitation. It's really great to be here with all of you and our listeners and viewers. Well, so when Denmark last year quite quickly embraced a mission-oriented approach, I think very much inspired from IIPP, we were all kind of curious as to what kind of framing of missions would take place. And of course, the overarching frame is the 70% target by 2030. But a bit surprising, perhaps, the green missions that were launched in Denmark and funded with about 100 million euros in the first year were rather technical in nature. So they were framed around power to X technologies, around carbon capture, one big one around, which was maybe one of the more holistic ones about the future of food systems, farming, and nature, and then one on plastics and the circular economy and plastic waste. So you could say that this is, of course, the country's first sort of larger scale attempt, but in a way, it didn't turn out to be so design driven, in the sense that it actually was a bit more technical, a bit more siloed, and sectoralized the approach. And we'll see from, there will be a review, I think, this the spring of the experience, how well it's gone. But I would say that what may be missing, and how design and designers could play a bigger role going forward when it comes to the transition, is really some of the points in our playbook that you mentioned, and which again is actually coming from a collaboration with IIPP, which is really about the role of designers in setting direction, first and foremost, and formulating more long-term, holistic visions and really also human stories about what success looks like and where we want to go, and really understanding both what kind of situations and behaviors are we looking for in the future, but also what would characterize the values and principles in that world. And an example of that is some of the work we've done in parallel to the Danish research missions around an even bigger one, namely the new European Bauhaus mission that the European Union has launched, where we in Denmark, and I know many other countries, have really focusing on what could this new European Bauhaus around bringing design and architecture to the forefront of our urban renewal, urban transitions. Well, we've looked at how can we formulate a mission that really becomes attractive. So we said, how can we create an irresistible circular society by as far out as 2050, and really mobilizing actors around that. So this has been an experiment, a really sort of very broad experiment in Denmark around mobilizing about 150 actors within industry, within design, architecture, to really explore an attractive future. So I think that's number one, setting direction, and really using the visual skills and the creative skills of designers, and also the process skills to create a space where many actors can formulate a vision together. And the second one is briefly just on this mobilization aspect of how do you actually get many actors around a shared purpose and shared vision. And I think there's a lot of design process, a lot of using visual artifacts and tools to process people around that, and create this common ground. And then finally, I think there's a role in what we might call capacity, which is sort of what are the skills, the competencies, the also activity portfolios we need to build to begin to move towards that desired future. And so I think there's this space around capacity, also learning processes. How do we actually build missions that are not set in stone but are adaptive, that are, for lack of a better word, that are agile and you can learn around, and also enfold new topics and fields, like we'll talk later about justice and inclusion, for example. How do you bring in many different types of fields and problems within a mission space? And I think for that reason, we need some kind of process design in it. Yeah, so that was, I think, my take on where we are right now. So some things slightly siloed, other things, I think, getting more design-driven.
That's really interesting. It's interesting to see how the role of the designer then kind of evolves within that. So to explore that a little bit further, I'm interested what that means. You described this kind of need to, you've got a role in capacity, skills and competencies. What does that mean in terms of design skills? Have they had to change? And the tool set, what new learning do designers themselves need to do in order to kind of be ready for this challenge?
So I think, and this of course comes from an institution that's serves the design field and works to advance the field, right? But I think it's a question of actually claiming the space. So working very hard to frame missions as holistic, frame missions as these desired futures that we need to, well, in some ways actually agree on. And I think where things fail is when sectors and special interests or sort of silos, get the lead in mission work. And so where I think there's so many things designers are great at, but one area where they are probably not so good, and I'm speaking as a political scientist kind of turned to design, it's really my old discipline, which is power. Power and interest, and dealing with the current situation, which is full of that, right? And how do you negotiate it, but also transcend it? And here I think a designerly way of working, and also design institutions like research and academic institutions, design actors like consultancies and so on, can easily get squished or become marginalized when the big power games between, for example, industry players, research communities, and so on get going. So if there's one dream I have, is that we are very aware in the design community around power and interest, and we get better at both negotiating it, but also finding, using our skills to get a common ground.
No, that's fascinating. And I think the kind of how you work with new facilitative tools in order to broaden conversations where maybe previously you were seen as the deliverer. There is a sort of moment where being able to bring that sort of political science knowledge and capacity and develop that as well for designers. I think that's a very interesting question of how you start building capacity there.
The sensibility. I mean, in the Danish Foreign Ministry, which is really very good at the power thing, they talk about having they call it in Danish musicality, and the ability to play the tune. And of course, designers also need to challenge assumptions and also push things, disrupt things. But I think it's also a question of how do you actually go in and negotiate these spaces, which are it's full of finance, full of money, full of power, full of politics, full of interests, and find a way to navigate it. I think there's a hope for designers, but it's a challenge.
Absolutely, and navigating those sort of power asymmetries sometimes. And I think that takes us really nicely to the work that Lesley-Ann's been working on, because I think how we think about some of these things in this more pluralistic way, which includes this wider conceit of who's a stakeholder in these missions, and how do we move forward in that. So thank you, Christian, for that kind of very interesting way of thinking about, and we'll come back to sort of maybe explore that in a little bit more depth about how you're doing that in practice later in the conversation. But let's widen the lens now to move across the Atlantic. As you know, the design of the session is design for inclusive, just and green missions. And so I'm really happy to bring in Lesley-Ann Noel here to ponder on what design might mean for that inclusive and just transition piece. Dr. Noel is an assistant professor and director of undergraduate programs at the College of Design at North Carolina State University. And her work looks at design thinking through emancipatory, critical and anti-hegemonic lenses, focusing on equity, social justice and the experiences of people who are often excluded from design research. Her research also highlights the work of designers outside of Europe and North America in this act of thinking about decolonizing design. And building on her work, which started in Trinidad, she's looked at emancipatory design, illustrating a concern that design is often seen as a discipline tied to both large industrialized economies and also problematizing things all the time, as opposed to maybe looking at what's possible or a possibility lens. So Lesley-Ann, having looked at design in small countries, and specifically, I think it's very interesting when we talk about things like climate adaptation, how landlocked developing countries or small island developing countries and the least development countries. And you've developed a design curriculum based on the idea that these extreme cases could actually inform traditional or mainstream design curricula. Can you tell us more about how emancipatory design thinking might support inclusive approaches to address the climate challenge, for example?
Okay, thank you, Rowan, for the invitation. And, it's really great to be here with Christian, Dan, you, Nora. And I guess the first thing I should say is that I wrote that article about, different starting points for design curricula, really as a kind of reactionary piece, because I found an article by, well, let me not say who it was by, right? But I found an article talking about, oh, well, design belongs to industrialized context or something like that. And, it was a message that I was receiving, as a lecturer in Trinidad, that really excluded then my kind of design practice. And so that article was almost like, okay, let's take it to the other extreme. If they're saying that design is for industrialized nations, what is the extreme? And so then I started to build a possible curriculum around the UN's extreme, which is small island developing states. And I'm from one of these least developed countries and other vulnerable states, right? I don't think it's the best. It really was a thought idea, and to emphasize that idea that design happens everywhere. You know, we can't just say, well, oh, it only happens in industrialized nations. It only happens if you came through University X, this is design, and if you're not from that context, it's not design. So I have then spent, I suppose, the last 8 years thinking about how we define design in academia and yeah, in practice, right? But to come back to the question, right? I think I'm actually going to come in and throw a little bit of fire into the conversation. Maybe not, maybe it won't catch. But I think that there is actually some tension between emancipatory and inclusive approaches, right? Because inclusive actually still suggests that there is a dominant narrative that we're just going to make a little bit of space for other people to be part of the conversation, you know? And so if we're starting from an inclusive perspective, I think that actually that, for me, that's a little bit problematic. And it's like an emancipatory approach facilitates greater participation, collaboration, maybe even friction within groups, and acknowledges that actually there are many more perspectives in conversations about climate change than a mainstream perspective that we're trying to get other people to be part of, right? And we're trying to include voices in this mainstream perspective. So if we are taking an emancipatory approach, we are then thinking of, you know, climate change for us, by us, all around the world, rather than this is climate change and you need to join us on this path, right? And so like there may be some global climate change issues, and I'm not a climate expert, I'm just from a small island, right? So there may be some global issues, but I think that success might come from focusing as well on like some really more specific issues for specific groups. You know, for me, like on a more personal level, I think that questions about climate can exclude the point of view of people from the so-called periphery, right? And sometimes it seems like other people's ideas and problems that have been, you know, kind of placed on us. So like I've been the annoying snide person who would you know, I'll say, okay, past me, not current me, right? I'd be the skeptical person who would be saying, okay, you've made your problems in the world and now you want us to fix it. But there are ways to make these issues very relevant and personal to people like me, people from a lot of different places around the world. And so therefore emancipatory approaches could be ways of surfacing these issues of what is important to people about climate change around the world, right? And so emancipatory design thinking, in the way that I've been using the term, is about identifying oppression and oppressive forces, you know, and working against them, shifting more decision-making and agenda-making power to the people who are impacted by the issues. You know, they might be called research subjects in other contexts, right? And who are these research participants, right? And how do you shift? So again, Christian talked about power. Emancipation is about power and shifting power. So who are the people who understand and feel these issues, and how do they want to react to them? It would be about promoting more research done by people for their people. So like citizen science and things like that, those are emancipatory methods. When people do oral histories as well, those are like emancipatory methods as well. And then understanding and reframing issues around the perspectives of people, right? Co-creating new meanings for issues, and you know, really emphasizing direct engagement of local priorities and perspectives, right? So, you know, I guess to underline everything, it's really just that new people and many people will bring new questions, and this emancipatory framing would embrace that and understand, okay, yes, there are new questions, and what do we do next? Rather than saying, well, okay, there's this one thing that we want people to fit within.
Thank you. I think there's so much in there, because I want to dwell a little bit on that, what you called friction, or and the importance of not being, not performative, avoiding performative inclusion. And so you gave us some really interesting ideas there, and a sort of a nod towards some tools like citizen science or oral histories, and what co-creation really looks like. And I think what came up for me with when you were saying that was actually the tensions between fast and slow, and this kind of urgency of everything has to be done by 2030 or we'll all die, and the reality underneath some of that as well, in that there is the genuine challenge of needing to move fast to address climate challenges, and but actually thinking about how do you make space for these new questions? How do you make space for this emancipatory and inclusive over time? I think as well, drawing in something that Christian said about how do we ensure that we have an inclusive process that is adaptive, or so that you can actually have a process that is about learning as much as it is about doing. I think design is often seen very much as this kind of doing sphere. And what you're talking about is, you've often worked with those who would traditionally be excluded from research. You work with community-led research and design-based learning. Sometimes this kind of work makes, when Christian was describing this kind of different people in the room, the financiers, the government agencies, etc., makes people very uncomfortable. I'm interested in how you navigate these. This inclusive design process, not calling it an inclusive design process, but a broader emancipatory collaborative design process. How do you navigate that friction? I think it's a really critical design skill, going back to the question I put to Christian earlier about what are the skills. But how do you do that?
That's the $1 million question. So when Christian was speaking, I actually wrote down adaptive and power and negotiating, and that might be a first indication as to how to start. You navigate this difficult process, knowing that the process is going to be difficult and uncomfortable, and embracing that discomfort, and talking openly and often. And okay, so Christian is in policy, and I'm normally working with smaller groups, in almost like doing design anthropology kind of stuff. So it's a different kind of conversation. I'm talking about relationships with small people, and then building relationships to allow then the discomfort to be able to happen, right? So, making sure that we're creating space for the many points of views, creating space for antagonism, and figuring out, okay, how are we going to deal with and like I said, I'm not dealing with policy, I'm dealing with a smaller focus, but we have to bring the discomfort into the conversation and make that part of the process. And also there is a thing, I've actually recently started collaborating with some designers who are not as, I keep thinking that, oh, we're all about co-design and whatnot. And I'm starting to see, well, actually, no, sometimes we're not good at co-design. But so there's something that we have to understand as designers, is that the thing will change, right? And so, we have to give up our original design, but draw on our design skills to design the new thing together, right? So, like I've been trying to nudge people in some of the classes that I teach to really embrace this facilitation role. And I've heard people push back against it. Like there was a colleague of mine who's an architect who's like, co-design, co-facilitation, this thing is awful. Everything ends up being watered down. But actually, we can lean on that skill that we have as designers and see how we can make all of these different people come together and design the new thing and give up some of what we had originally, right? Probably kind of lost the thread of some of what you were asking, but I think it is if we keep in mind, it is less about inclusion and it is more about, I mean, you know, I like the word, the pluriverse. And so it is that idea of, oh, there are many worlds, and it's how are we facilitating these conversations across these many worlds? Then I think that's where the inclusive process develops.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think it's, I mean, that's very resonant for me, hearing the kind of, sometimes the power within the designer is in the room as well, is material in the room, and the designer as facilitator is sometimes a role that designers need to learn to, you know, having been in quite a position of power with, as creative strategist or creative generator, the creative in the room, to then try and democratize, if you like, or create participatory creativity, can be a whole different skill set. You know, if you know, especially as you were speaking earlier about the kind of design institutions that are the institutions that legitimize design practice. If you've learned in some of these schools, you'll never have learned some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, and we have to find these participatory processes are, we have to value them, right? And you know, they really do require different skills and you know, focus on maybe relationships and slowness. You talked about the urgency of climate change, and to get buy-in from a lot of people. You know, maybe it's that we have to design the conversation so there are parallel discussions and parallel conversations. So there's the fast conversation, and then there is a slower conversation that we can get more people involved and allow a lot of other people to bring in some design language to co-create then new possibilities and realities, and then let them buy into that if they're not buying into the faster messages.
No, absolutely. And I think there's something to come back on in terms of adaptation, and actually adaptation challenges in themselves may require adaptive design processes which are very inclusive in nature or pluralistic in nature. I think that's a really good segue into bringing Dan into the conversation, because I think Dan's been working in this sphere probably for longer than many designers doing this kind of work, you know, taking that practice to the field, to the people. But let me welcome Dan Hill as Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, the Swedish government's innovation agency, because Dan has been working with policymakers and others, but also with stakeholders and citizens, currently running a missions program. And you know, previously Dan has worked to produce, you know, inclusive projects which were innovative, influential, and aiming to transform areas, everything from digital through to place-based renewal projects from the UK, Australia, Finland, Italy, and Sweden. He's been around a lot. But I'm really interested, particularly at the work that you've been doing in Sweden, Dan, because I think it's tried to cross the pluriverse, if we like, through at that kind of top line, what are the policy missions that we're seeking out, but then taking through the kind of levels of abstraction of what does that mean in the field, what does that mean on the street. So I'm really interested to hear more about your approach and how you went about that, specifically through your processes of engagement in design.
Sure. It's funny, I'm less interested in that now. having done it for 3 years, I'm much more interested in what Christian and Lesley-Ann are talking about, in a sense. But I think that was great, this kind of tension between true participation and inclusion and the spectrum of positions there. But I will tell you what I've just been doing in Sweden, I guess, and because it tells that story, I think, anyway. So what we tried to do was take the idea of missions down to the ground, in a sense, and take the theory or the structure. If you all probably know Mariana's original diagram of a kind of a challenge with a mission and then a set of sectors delivered through a set of projects, which is kind of this structural relationship. Makes perfect sense in lots of ways. But then we said, well, how does that actually happen? And that means it's something over time. It's not structural. It's something which, you know, must start somewhere and then has a series of adaptive processes. So we flipped it on its side, sort of almost switched it through 90 degrees, like stretching it over a timeline instead. And part of the rationale for that was that we wanted to make it participative, actually. We didn't want to say that, okay, the missions are set by taking one of the UN's global goals and just, you know, taking one of the targets, or even the Swedish government has various targets, as you can imagine, actually hundreds of targets, like, you know, the first fossil-free welfare state, and we have targets for carbon at various levels and so on and so on. So we felt actually this thing about missions isn't about targets at all. We're surrounded by targets. It must be about action. It must be about something happening. And so we wanted to co-create that. And that was also looking at Sweden's tradition a little bit from, let's say, the 1920s and 30s in particular, which was this very kind of collaborative process of nation building at the time. It was sort of workers and the government and industry sitting down together in a series of rooms. And it was very much a bunch of white men sitting in a room and deciding what Sweden was about, for sure. But it lifted a country from one of the poorest in Europe to one of the wealthiest in one generation. And so it's kind of part of the DNA to at least sit and talk together and figure it out collectively. And that might take some time in the Swedish model, which is interesting hearing Lesley-Ann talk about slowness, because we have a sort of a tendency in the culture, Christian might laugh at this, but to talk quite a lot. Certainly Finland says that about Sweden. But having talked quite a lot, in theory, then one could agree a set of positions and move forward as a bunch of collectives, if you like. That was interesting. What I find fascinating, what Lesley-Ann was talking, is that that doesn't work anymore, and arguably never really worked for everybody. So it excluded lots of people, which was sort of quietly left out of that story of Sweden's modernization. Everybody from Sami people in the north, the indigenous people in the north of Sweden, where there were horrific things happening in the 1930s and afterwards, actually for most of the 20th century, and still are. At the same time as this very collective participative process. So both of those histories are equally true, or equally valid in a sense. So it's complex immediately. We wanted to drag a different kind of participation out. And that's where immediately we look at, you know, Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation from, I think, 1969. But at the top of that, the most sort of the sort of peak, Everest peak of participation is ownership. In the middle is things like consultation and discussion. And at the lowest end is, you know, coercion, which is what was happening a lot as well. So we wanted to make it really about ownership. And so long story short, we did pull a bunch of people into multiple rooms. We got through 500 organizations in about 6 months, stakeholder groups, public, private, civic, and others, and some experts. I work in the government, so we have to, in a sense, engage with some of those folk. But what we're looking for was starting points, not the answer, but the question, I think, as Lesley-Ann said as well. Where could we start with a couple of areas? And we just picked mobility and we picked food. Numerous reasons, I won't go into them, but mobility, not vehicles, not cars, not, you know, but actually mobility, which is a much more open question. And food, of course, you can take in any direction: culture, history, biology, geography, landscape, environment, blah, blah, blah. And we're working with these groups in this very participative way for entry points, and then very quickly we then move them into prototypes on the ground, and that's when it becomes truly participative. So one of our missions was around reimagining all the streets in Sweden, if I can put it that way, or retrofitting streets, or ensuring that the streets are healthy and sustainable and full of life. And full of life was left as an open thought. You know, that could be full of bees and butterflies, or it could be full of people in a downtown on a Friday night. They're both full of life. You know, it depends on which street we're talking about. And there are 40,000 kilometers of street in Sweden already built. So this was immediately saying this is about working with the fabric we already have, the real places on the ground that already exist. And we can then go to those places. We being, I'll come back to that. That we can open up the possibility of what those streets are about. So again, long story short, we have this principle: the street belongs to the street, which I nicked from Michael Sorkin, an architect in New York, who had this lovely set of principles for reimagining streets. And number one is the street belongs to the street. And so we picked about 4 or 5 streets in the middle of Stockholm to begin with, and they all had schools on them, and it meant, and actually quite young age kids schools, so 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. And what we did was we put the pen in their hand and said, you decide what the street is about. It's your street, really. The school is the dominant actor on those streets, actually. And so I could show you now some nice pictures of kids making lovely drawings of streets and so on. But in a sense, this was a real act of shifting the power hierarchy. You can imagine streets are very controlled in Sweden, as you know, by transport engineers and people with professional qualifications, and it's highly regulated and so on. And here we were putting pens in the hands of 6-year-old kids. And of course, their point of view is actually far more valid because it's their street. And so they came up with fake palm trees and sandpits and, you know, playgrounds, but also swing sets and bike racks. And, you know, actually kids are great designers given half the chance. And the other side of this, again, I'll come to the end now, is a mission around school food. And again, that's because school food is an enormous pre-installed system in Sweden. It's half of the meals served every day. It's about 2 million meals a day running through that system. Every kid in Sweden has access to it for free. So it's this enormous kitchen, if you think of it stretched over the country like that. It's one regulated machine for making school food, and it's oriented around outcomes of basic nutrition, food hygiene, so kids don't die, which is a good start, and cost. And we said, well, what if you use that, a bit like the street question, actually as a lever to unlock regenerative farming, food waste, different kinds of logistics, different food cultures, sharing the food with the neighborhood around, growing food on school grounds. You know, there's tons of things you can do with food. How do you fall into the curriculum? You can teach every subject from the curriculum through food: biology, history, the story of colonialism, the story of diversity. It's all possible to tell that through food. So again, heavily participative service designers that we worked with went into schools and worked with kids about reimagine your food environment, where you eat, where the food comes from, going out to the farm to see where the food comes from, and so on and so on. And beginning to sort of pull the thread on that system, starting with the plate, but then like pulling the thread and dragging it back through the system until you end up with regenerative, fair and just farming or something like this. So both those missions, again, we did use experts, we did use the existing systems. We had Volvo cars and Oatly and people like that involved in kind of getting their input. But we quickly reframed that as, where could we start? Like, what's an environment for exploring complexity, for questions? And how do we do that in a way which I wouldn't go as, I mean, I'm in no way would I pretend it's where Lesley-Ann has set the bar, which I think is, she set that in the right place, by the way. And I think we are kind of climbing up that ladder of participation in that direction. And that's super hard in Sweden, as you can imagine, because we have a very professionalized, well-established public sector full of processes, and it's very based around legitimacy and expertise and professional credibility and all those problematic things. You can't shift that system overnight. But what we wanted to do was find these environments where we could pull people together in that place and explore the complexity together, not go in there with a bunch of assumptions, but pull the assumptions out on the table. Get into questions of what Chantal Mouffe would call agonistics, where we can, we can disagree in public. Make it about car parking in the street. I feel you get to disagreements very quickly. Make it about meatballs, you get to disagreements very quickly indeed about what's appropriate for kids to eat and what they mean. You know, these are deeply cultural questions. They're not technical, although they have technology in them embedded. So anyway, I won't go on because I know there's 1,000 things we need to talk about, but it was setting up this, think of these missions as more like environments to test these ideas in, and that's been a real-time process. It's not a fire and forget document, a policy process actually. It's something which is adaptive and ongoing and complex and requires constant engagement and learning. And I wouldn't pretend we're any more than 3 rungs up that ladder, but we've taken, those first 3 rungs are big steps, put it that way. They're the really hard ones. To get a policymaker out of their office, down into the street, have an argument with someone about car parking, ask whether they can pay for a tree because a tree is a health worker, and therefore immediately dissolve all the silos that implies. You know, those are the steps that we've taken, and that's I think potentially a radical interpretation of missions in the end if we can keep pushing that agenda. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
No, I think I want to tease a little bit more out based on that, because I think you gave a really good example of a sort of risk and play-based experimental approach to co-design for these missions, which sounds really like it was endeavouring to, as you say, climb the ladder of participation. I'm interested because at the same time you described the kind of process heavy and almost hierarchical culture of how things get done in Sweden, legitimized in Sweden. So a question of like, how do you get the air cover? What kind of legitimizing forces did you need for that process to be seen and respected within the sort of very professionalized culture?
That's a huge question, and it goes to your sort of interpretation of democracy, I guess, because Sweden at least is a democratic country theoretically, and I work in the Swedish government, so I have to say that. But it's there's many kinds of democracy. Obviously, there's representative democracy, which is relatively hierarchical, as in we appoint someone with our vote, and they take a bunch of decisions essentially, and we can talk to them, of course. There's a relative amount of freedom of speech and so on, but it's very much a case of handing it over to the system to run the place for you. So we have, you know, expert agencies who will run transport and food on behalf of politicians who've been elected by the public. There are other kinds of democracy, of course, or even just decision-making, cultures of decision-making, I guess we talk about. And participation is something else. It's not representation, or rather it's a continuum between those two. And so the reason we pick streets and schools is because you can zoom into them and you can see the differences from one to another very, very precisely. You know, one street is completely different to the street next door, actually. The system often, I'm using it in a very loose sense, treats them as the same thing. Like a car parking law is the same on both of those streets, but the people are completely different. And so we wanted to test, how do you do this participative decision-making about everyday systems that surround us, things which otherwise we've abstracted out of the way of people's agency. So what if, again, the street could own the street and design the street? What does that mean for the role of the transport planner? It's very, very complex, and it's not clear at all. We're throwing all kinds of little hand grenades into the system as soon as we do that. And I'm not saying I have the answers for it, by the way, but that is the question that we're embarking on. So when it comes to your point specifically, the legitimacy to start the process, we said, look, we've agreed we're going to achieve the global goals within the next 8 years. That's been signed up for by the country, right? And many other countries. We've said we're going to do this and this and this. That gives us a remit democratically in the representative sense to pursue this agenda. We have to crush carbon emissions. You know, the country more or less agrees on that, right? The problem is how specifically, and what are the trade-offs there? And that we're trying to pull down to the ground and say, what does that mean for our systems of everyday life, our places, our cultures, our communities? And that is a participative question. We want to explore as many possible ways of cracking that nut as possible. So this is about, again, plurality, which has come up a bit, and diversity. I know that Gothenburg will do it differently to Stockholm. And if we need to change the common laws between them, fine, but I want to really see as many experiments as possible heading towards that North Star of a zero carbon thing, or whatever it might be, with socially just and healthy environments. But I want to see how Gothenburg tackles it, how Uppsala tackles it, how Malmö tackles it, how Stockholm tackles it, street by street, the differences and the conversations. We can actually do that. You know, we're set up as a country to have 10,000 conversations simultaneously if necessary. We don't have to start with the Prime Minister. So arguably, we go the other way around. We start super small, super local. And you know this, Rowan, but I have this metaphor of just like a snowball rolling down a hill, which makes sense in Sweden. I don't know how it goes for you, Lesley-Ann. It's like, you know, as it
just
rolls,
a puddle by the end of it.
I know you know at least theoretically what I mean. So it's like, as it rolls down the hill, it gathers and gathers and gathers, and you're gathering learning and legitimacy and momentum and experimentation and diversity. And then maybe at the end, we take it to the Prime Minister and we say, look, we've got now 10,000 experiments running. They're all heading in these directions in different ways. Isn't that interesting? By the way, we need you to change the parking space law or something. But at that point, we have that information. We've got real analysis, we've got real detail, we've got pictures and stories and narratives, and you know, we've got real evidence. So we don't start with the Prime Minister, we perhaps end with them, and that may be the interesting
Absolutely. Giving yourself enough runway to get to the Prime Minister, I think, is a key part of that too. Christian, you have your hands up, and then I have your hand up, and then I have a few questions from the audience. But Christian, over to you first.
Well, so Dan's story and Lesley-Ann's really inspires me to think about what kind of new infrastructures do we really need, or enabling actors, I might say, do we need? Because Sweden is lucky to have have Dan and have Vinnova, and other countries might be lucky to have some institutions that kind of take on this exploration of what mission-oriented innovation might mean, bringing in design. But we all know that to sort of get that snowball big enough and not crashing along the way or melting away and so on, we need to maintain the process and adapt it as well over a long time.
Yeah.
And so my current interest is really, what kind of new third places do we need, or infrastructure do we need, where it's not that organization, it's not that organization, it's not government, but it's something in between that we collectively ask to, empower us, not to decide and not to amass funding, but to really be an infrastructure in the best possible meaning, which allows this emergence to happen, and also allows the navigation with policy priorities and democratic processes, which are also legitimate enough. I mean, we see in the world today, I think, a weakening of democratic processes, even the most formal ones. So I'm kind of thinking that there's this question of mission infrastructure, or what are the third places we need to maybe shape and create that can do more and longer term of what you just shared, Dan?
Mm. Maybe I could jump in for a bit, because Dan, your project is amazing, right? What you talk about is amazing, and you seem to be working then with organizations that will support this. And there was a question that I responded to in the chat, where I wanted to say, so I'm in academia, right, solidly, and the experiments that I create around social innovation are happening in the classroom, where I'm being disruptive and then sharing, okay, this is a disruptive best practice that we tried. And so maybe that's kind of like, how do we create more of these kinds of spaces within? So this is a good kind of possible third space where we can, yes, be experimental and disruptive and things like that, while supporting a public mission and supporting a government mission.
Mm.
I
I totally agree, actually. And I've done some work just in the last couple of months with AHO, the School of Architecture and Design in Oslo. I'm working with students on precisely that kind of idea, and I really like the idea of the university as a place that can hold a sort of public discussion about the future of the city and help shape it in some way. And it maybe is a third place because it's not government, but they're often public, or there's some kind of public agency involved. And to get students working on that in a way that isn't consultant, and that's without the problems that come with that, but also like slightly arm's length from civil servants who sometimes can't always, explore all of the things that students and researchers can do. So there's something interesting about, as you said, Christian, these kind of third places or other infrastructures. I think, public libraries also have an amazing role to play in this sense. Community groups, food markets. I'm obsessed by what Eric Klinenberg calls social infrastructures, these kinds of spaces.
No, I think that's a very interesting one about rethinking then who has the convening power. I think in many instances, organizations or institutions have seen themselves as in line with their remit, and maybe can't see the power of that they may have already as conveners. An example being the BBC in the UK, where I think actually the BBC's almost its greatest asset is its convening power, its ability to bring platform effects to wider community conversations. But similarly, there is, as you say, the Civic University and there are various different efforts in the UK. Nottingham Civic University had a program for a while that was doing that kind of thing. How do we start thinking in that way? who is the host is the question there, you know, and who is the professional. So many interesting things coming up in the conversation. Now you've inspired 11 questions, and we have not even 11 minutes left, so we shan't be having 11 questions. Christian's been incredibly industrious and has answered all the questions. So those people who have asked the questions may be satisfied, but those taking the live stream later might go, but what was the answer? So I'm going to pick 3 maximum, I think, so that we try and end in time. I may not even make it to 3, so that people can hear you answer some of these questions, because I think that they've been really very interesting. I'm going to start with Kit England's question. Kit says, I've had the fortune to run a wider, more inclusive design process designing Glasgow City Region's adaptation strategy. It was valuable and made for a better outcome, but how do we make the case for use of such approaches, which many traditional public sector people don't see and involves giving up power? It's hard to draw a line between cause and effect, i.e. inclusive emancipatory approaches making better policy choices. So it's that navigating that tensions that you were describing earlier, maybe the snowball working in some instances there. But I'm interested maybe to go to Lesley-Ann first, and then also here, given that there's such a large scale Denmark mission, the missions are very much out there in the public consciousness. How does that then become a conversation that can be more reflective, maybe, or slow down a little? But let's start, Lesley, if you have some thoughts on that.
So yeah, I mean, I guess none of us have the magic answers. I think that alongside the mission, or part of the mission, is our philosophies, right? So sometimes we're invited to do work that is slightly different, and maybe because we have a certain philosophy, an emancipatory philosophy, we can start to change the way the work is designed. And some of what we do involves educating the people who are asking us to do the work. So I'm reading what Kit has said. How do we make the case for such approaches? We have to kind of do a little bit of teaching, and sometimes we're going to make big adjustments to terms of references or scope of works, and sometimes we're just going to make tiny adjustments. And it's like, as we modify the way that we work over time, eventually this will be seen as best practices. Maybe a little wishy-washy, but that I think we can't change the way everybody thinks about emancipatory approaches, but we can do what we do and talk about them, and eventually these approaches will be seen as, talk and write and whatever we have to do about them, and they'll be seen as more accepted. They'll become more accepted over time.
If I were to categorize what Christian said he said it far more eloquently than this, but in like 2 words, you say seek for forgiveness rather than permission. Is that what you mean, Christian? I don't want to put that into your mouth if that's not what you mean.
Well, I've always been a big fan of that approach, and in a way, I mean, also as an independent foundation at the DDC, we are moving into mission spaces around, for example, mental health and mental thriving, where people would ask, what's your role in that? Why would you move to that direction around rethinking that space, which is complex and difficult and a global problem, actually, especially after the pandemic. And I think in a way it's like, well, we are offering ourselves, or we are putting ourselves into this place because we think we can be part of moving it forward somehow. And I wouldn't say the solution, because these things are not solved per se, but they are addressed, they are worked with, they're worked on. And I think, as we already talked about a bit just a moment ago, that this different type of actors that are not in a sector, like libraries, as you said, Dan, or universities that are also pluralistic in their origin and in their outlook, where free thought is allowed, is some of what we need. And we need, of course, also the grassroots organizations to offer their grounding and their relationships with people and communities. So I think there's this I think rather we need more who offer themselves and say, we would like to contribute. How can we be part of this? How can we, and not less. And so I think we are in the stage where we know that government cannot solve these things alone. We also know that they're not very good at doing it with others. So we need to start helping them.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting question in terms of how can designers enter into very complex conversations, and sometimes these conversations are scientifically complex, what's the nature of what might happen here, or what might happen in the world with regards to rising emissions, etc. But then sometimes they're deeply personal as well. If you start having conversations that bring in, that may be triggering or bring in issues, very personal issues, there are questions of how designers operate. There's a recent paper that was shared with me. How do they operate with a license, if you like? Are they capable of dealing with what they bring up? And if some of this stuff is very challenging, it's not just about friendly friction or discomfort, but actually can be, triggering trauma or can actually create conflict. And how does the designer evolve, I guess, to be able to take conversations to a more complex space, but then not say that the designer can do everything, because I think there are challenges there. Like, how do you work with, professionals or those in the space who might be able to manage, so that design isn't therapy, if you like. User research doesn't become therapy, because that's not necessarily its space. There are a couple of, we have not got time. We've now got about a squillion questions, which is always what happens, and we've got 2 minutes left. But I think there's an interesting question that's been put in by Giovanni at the end, which actually builds on this question of, the need for new institutions. And he says about the need for institutional arrangements in the current state of political polarization. Do you have a vision or experience on what convening the actual members of different political parties, or even just thinking about polarities? Is it possible to foresee a role as design as a tool for creating shared knowledge, language, and common framing of societal challenges? I mean, that's a huge question, but I don't know if there's how might how might design enter into that? But I will go to you, Dan, seeing as I suggested that was your question to answer.
The Freudian slip. I think the last part of the question, I think there's something there, like as in a common language and shared values. I mean, that with the caveat you just applied, Rowan, which I think is really powerful about designers can't do everything at all. In fact, we're often useless at most things. But we can perhaps bring a sort of integrative thinking. That's one of the things designers can do. Once you begin to understand the landscape and dig in deep, and you do have to know your stuff. I'm not a fan of very shallow design research explorations, but if you do begin to dig in deep and get into the landscape, you can integrate things, pull them together, often begin to synthesize or speculate with, or build processes of speculation that are more participative again, and begin to build what I talked about these prototypes where you can start testing this stuff together. In that, you're beginning to build shared vocabulary, sometimes shared visions, fleshing out assumptions, ideas about what you mean by technology or not. Like all of those questions can come to bear. I think what I struggle with the first part of the question is party politics, and that's where I think that's a hard landscape to work in as a designer, if I'm honest. So I think that's where I was talking earlier about this difference in participative and representative democracies, and I think we have to really reframe the way we think about how much weight we put up and down that spectrum, and loading everything into party politics. We're just seeing the hard limits on that at the moment. So again, I don't know what the answer is on the other side of that, but I suspect it's something around this far more super local participative, knitting things together over time approach, as opposed to top-down party political mass movement led in some way.
Well, thank you so much for that. We have hit the hour, and I recognise that many people will have only put aside the hour to be able to watch this and join us from all over the world, because we've had people saying thank you from Brazil and Mexico and everywhere, Valencia in Spain, and having to leave. So I'm going to draw us to a close now to say thank you so much for what a wonderful, rich and interesting conversation. There were so many questions, and thank you so much for answering them in the chat as well. And this will now go onto the YouTube channel, and we'll probably try and follow it up with a blog trying to answer the questions, because there's so much interesting and so many further conversations to build on that, but we will save that for a future date. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel, Christian Bason, and Dan Hill from coming at us from Sweden and North Carolina and Copenhagen. So I've appreciated this global chat, and thank you to all of our listeners, viewers, for joining us as well. So great to see you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.